I would say that my immigration story, sure, it began in 1995 when I first stayed here. My parents decided we were gonna have to stay here in the US. But I came to really understand my place in the immigration conversation when I graduated from high school. And I think that's pretty normal or not normal, but it's a pretty common story for undocumented youth to realize, oh my God, I'm leaving high school, a place that you consider safe, and into the real world. Luckily for me, I graduated high school in 2001 here in California, in Long Beach, California. And in 2001, it was, we had something called AB 540 here in the US. And AB 540 allowed undocumented students and US citizens to pay in-state tuition. Now for me, that was a big deal because I didn't qualify for financial aid at the time. This is 2001, so I'm 35. I know I don't look it, but I've been in this game for a while. It was really helpful though because I was able to pay in-state tuition, and I'm happy that we're here at Long Beach City College because this was my first option. At that time in 2001. Tuition was around $11 a unit. I'm pretty sure that's not the case anymore. But for somebody who's undocumented, who was working, any kind of job, like I was doing dishwashing, I was working, I work at different stores, getting paid under the table, paying in-state tuition was a huge help. Also, 2001 was another important year because that was the first time that the DREAM Act was introduced. The DREAM Act would have allowed undocumented students like myself to get some sort of status if we went to college or if we joined the military. Of course, I was in the college track. When I finally found out about the DREAM Act, I actually found out through my mom about the DREAM Act. She was watching something in the news on Univision, and she was like, I saw this thing on Univision that there's some undocumented students at UCLA talking about being DREAM Act students and trying to pass the DREAM Act. And it was my mom who really politicized me, around the DREAM Act. I remember going to an event at UCLA, and I remember hearing Tam Tran speak. And Tam, who unfortunately is not here with us anymore, she was a trailblazer because her story was very impactful for a lot of us. I remember hearing Tam speak about her status as an undocumented immigrant. She was using journalism and filmmaking as a way to document what was happening with undocumented activists. Tam always and has been this sort of footprint for a lot of us who began to document what was happening, with the DREAM Act. 2010 was a very pivotal year for undocumented immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants who would have qualified for the DREAM Act. That year, 5 undocumented students sat in McCain's office in Arizona in May of 2010, and they were like, we're gonna sit here until you decide to support the DREAM Act. That was historical because this was the first time that undocumented students were not hiding behind a camera, not hiding their names. They were putting their bodies and their face and saying, if you're gonna talk about undocumented issues, you gotta look at us in the face. Tanya, Lisbeth, Yahaira, Mo, and Raul. Those 5 people changed my life entirely. They were changing the narrative and totally saying, if you're gonna talk about undocumented issues, you gotta talk to us and you gotta see us. We're not gonna be hiding. We're not gonna be, letting other people speak on our behalf. We're gonna be the ones telling that narrative. And if that means getting arrested, so be it. The 5 people that sat down, 4 of them identify as queer. And that to me, as a queer and undocumented person, that meant a lot because we knew what it was like to be in the closet. We knew what it's like to have a secret, to trust. Who are you gonna trust with this secret that could put you potentially in danger, whether it be deportation or, your physical danger, There's homophobia still, there's transphobia still. And so the fact that 4 of them were queer really blew my mind. The fact that they were openly queer and saying we're undocumented and we're also queer. If we know throughout history, whenever we're part of a movement, when from civil rights movement, the Chicano movement, any movement, whenever you're queer, you're always told, let's focus on the issue. In this case, was immigration, right? Like, let's pass the DREAM Act, let's pass immigration reform, immigration reform, but can we not talk about the gay stuff? The reason was that we had a lot of supporters who were religious, and they didn't want to talk about that part of immigration. And for a lot of us, it was really important because at that time, this was before gay marriage, if you had a partner, who was a U.S. citizen, like you didn't have the option of getting married. And so, we had to break it down within the immigration movement. And I had a lot of instances where I would hear other immigrant organizers being openly homophobic, openly transphobic. And so we had to call it out and have conversations, uncomfortable conversations. I remember going to gay bars, and I know a gay bar, you might think it was just a place to go drinking. I mean, no, a gay bar historically has been places where queer people come together and organize. And so the fact that me as a queer, undocumented person couldn't go to certain places because of my matricula, my Mexican ID, like that made me feel othered within my own group. And so constantly I had to talk about those things within my queer community. So my queer community. When I think about that civil disobedience and the civil disobediences that happened after 2010, I really see that as a piece of art. I know probably the organizers, if they hear me say that, they're gonna be like, dude, we were fucking scared of getting arrested, but go with me with this point. They were taking back this idea of who gets to tell their story. They were saying, if we're gonna get deported, we're gonna get deported our own. Like, we're gonna be the ones figuring it out, how we're gonna carry ourselves in this. We're not gonna have, a bunch of people on uniforms getting us, deporting us when nobody's watching. They had the media there. They had a bunch of other undocumented people supporting this event because we knew we had each other's back, And so to a certain extent, me who, as a journalism, student, understood the power of media. What happens when you are talking about a group of people and you don't see their faces? It's very easy for other people who might think that they never met an undocumented person to really dehumanize them. When they had the media there covering all the civil disobediences, I knew the importance of the media covering this event because people were looking at the folks who were getting arrested. They looked like their children's friends. They look like the kids who went to college with, their cousins. As somebody who studied journalism, who was very obsessed with documenting everything, I felt that my contribution was to create art that really pushed and documented what was happening. Even though the media was covering these actions, they were still calling us illegal immigrants. They were still calling us illegal aliens. They were still calling us, I feel like we were the only ones who could tell that story. Who better than other people who are undocumented to really tell a three-dimensional story of ourselves? The undocumented identity was placed on me, like papers. What are papers? But the queer aspect, of it, for me was very important to make sure to add that. As we are now in the year 2019, many things have changed, but there's still, people in detention. There's the battle hasn't been won yet, until everybody's free, right? The fact that there's a lot of anti-Blackness in our community. There's a lot of, transphobia. There's still things that we need to change. And so I think that it's important that those narratives that we are able to control those narratives. "2012 was another important year for a lot of us undocumented immigrants. 2012, then President Barack Obama signed Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, aka DACA. For a lot of us, it was a very sweet, sweet and sour moment. Is that the right way? Sweet and sour moment, because it wasn't the DREAM Act. The Dream Act would have given us a path, get a green card, and eventually potentially citizenship, which assures you that you won't get deported. DACA was not it. DACA was giving us a work permit. It helped, definitely alleviated the situation for a lot of us, but it could be taken away at any moment. Around that time, Time magazine, came knocking. Well, not to me personally. Jose Antonio Vargas, who's probably one of the most known undocumented immigrants, Pulitzer Prize winner, journalist. A year prior, he had come out as undocumented, and Time magazine asked him to do a cover story about his experience of this year being undocumented. And he invited a bunch of us. So I was on the cover of Time magazine, no big deal. I remember we were so happy because, we were going to be on the cover of Time magazine. We were celebrating the fact that DACA happened. Many of us were very critical because our parents were not going to be part of, they were not going to benefit. Jose Antonio Vargas himself did not benefit from DACA because he didn't meet the age, there was an age limit. I remember that day because we were so happy. We were going to be on the cover of Time magazine, for God's sakes. That was a big deal. But then the magazine came out, and I remember we all looked so sad. We had this face of like, pobrecitos, these little immigrants who are, I don't know, like people feel sorry for us. That was a kind of weird feeling because I don't want people to feel sorry for me. I want you to fight next to me. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. And so it got me thinking about who made the decision to put that photo in there, who made the decision to not choose us full of joy, but kind of sad. I started thinking about like the people who were behind the camera. I didn't see a lot of people of color, in that shoot. And so for me, the importance of having a newsroom that is diverse. I remember my experience in a newsroom in a community college, Long Beach City College, and it was very diverse. We had many different ideas. Why then does a lot of the newsrooms do not reflect that? The fact that they chose that picture specifically had a lot to do with the fact that they probably didn't have any undocumented journalists in there, any journalists who had an immigrant background, because they wanted to go with this sort of like sad moment. I don't want to take away the fact that cultural moment was very important. I stress that. That moment was very important because we were on the cover of a major magazine, and that's a big step. I think that we are living in times of crisis. I have a series of pieces that I call them illegals in times of crisis, because when Mr. 45 got elected in 2016, I got a lot of calls from people who were worried about me. They were like, oh my God, this guy who got elected, you're gonna get deported, DACA's gonna be taken away, are you worried? And to me, I was like, I've been worried all my life. Tapping into that sadness, tapping into that constant fear, I'm kind of getting over it. I'm kind of getting tired. Yes, of course, I'm constantly thinking in the back of my mind, are my parents gonna be okay tomorrow? Is DACA gonna be taken away? What's gonna happen to me? But there's also other aspects of my life that I don't see in the media a lot. What about the worker who is having a thriving business and is undocumented, sure, but is giving back to the community? What about my good friend who's a DJ and has a nightclub where it's very central about immigrants having fun for one night? Like going clubbing, it's important. Again, I'm mentioning that earlier. Those stories are very important because it gives us a three-dimensional narrative rather than the one narrative that it's very real. Sadness, it's a real thing. Being scared is a real thing, but there's more to us than that. And I think that a good journalist is gonna find that story. They're gonna dig deep and like find those stories that makes us more than our tragedy. Last week, I was speaking at a college in the East Coast, and when I talk, I curse a lot. And this older woman came up to me And she was like, te voy a regañar. You curse too much. She reminded me of my grandma, like she wouldn't want to hear me talk that way. But then I also thought about the people who are constantly telling us that immigrants have to be perfect. Immigrants cannot make mistakes. Immigrants must always show this sort of like, almost like I always have to be thankful every single day of my life that I'm here in the US, even though I've given so much to this country. But I also curse. I also make mistakes. I also am not a perfect person. And so while, yeah, I understand that narrative that we gave during the DREAM Act movement, that we're good immigrants, I don't think that's a healthy thing to do, because it then puts the bar like right here. Yeah, there's people who get away. White people get to be complex. White people get to be all these things, yet we have to be perfect. And so I'm by nature kind of silly, but whenever I talk about certain things like this, I have to infuse the humor. And when I'm talking to a bunch of college students, they all curse. They all curse. So like, to me, like whenever I'm talking about myself, whenever I'm speaking about my art, I don't want to take myself so serious, because I don't take myself so serious. But also humor for me has been a way to deal with the sadness. I personally do not identify it as a dreamer, because I see that as a term that you see when, or you kind of put on yourself when you're still in college, and that you're from high school to college, right? You're still young enough that that's a thing that you identify with. And I'm happy that term exists, because when I graduated from high school, I used to call myself illegal. I used to be like, yeah, I'm an illegal immigrant. The issue that I have with this narrative or this label is that it's not the only narrative. Yes, there's college students. Yes, there's students who, have, done amazing things. They've now you have undocumented students in Harvard. You have professors who are undocumented students, and that's great. But those are not the only stories. When there's an imbalance of telling of who gets the spotlight, I know I'm very privileged to get a lot of attention for the work that I do, and sometimes I'm like, okay, I'm not the only one. Can we talk to this other undocumented artist? There's like all this other undocumented. And so like, how do you use that little power? Because it is a cultural power that I do have. I'm not gonna deny that. So it's like, how do you use that to, like, if we make it, we all making it, right? Because that's how I come from community. I can't not see it any other way. We have to respect how people decide to identify. And I'm happy that now there's a plethora of groups that people see to find their people, to find their community, because there's nothing more beautiful than sitting down with a bunch of undocumented people where I don't have to explain why it sucks to be undocumented. Like, it's something that we know. It's 2019, and there's kids and moms and fathers and grandpas and young men and young women under a bridge. And the fact that you have a president calling them animals, it's a big deal. It's a big issue. And this dude knows how to use media. He knows how to use media to his own advantage, because we are seeing the rise of people who are openly racist. They call it not being politically correct, but that's just another code for saying, I'm gonna hate on you openly. While I can't sit down with every single person and change their mind, because we can't, it's impossible. I think it's the job of people who have access to take those pictures, to make documentaries like this, to make sure that the story that you're telling, it's a full story. Me, as an undocumented immigrant who benefits from DACA, I'm in a huge privilege that I get to talk about this in front of a camera and not I'm not dealing. It's a whole different world. But I have to include it in the conversations that I have. I have to include it in my art. I have to make sure that if I'm making art about unaccompanied minors, young folks who don't qualify for DACA, how am I making sure that they're the ones telling their own story and I don't repeat the cycle that I criticize, that I don't speak on behalf of other undocumented immigrants who have been in detention. I've never been inside of a detention center. So it's how you yield that little power that you have and how you are opening spaces for other folks to tell their own stories and to make sure that they're the ones telling their own story, because I don't know what that feeling is like. As we move forward, as you know, our stories as undocumented students, dreamers, they're getting the highlight. We got to make sure to kind of step to the side and make sure to be like, there's a current situation happening right now, and how are those folks telling their own stories? So I can't imagine what it's like to be caught in that bridge until those kids or those folks get a camera, get their own chance to tell their own stories, because I can't. All I can do is kind of move to the side a little bit and be like, pass the mic.